his PhD on the symbolism of marble from antiquity until the age of the Enlightenment opened his eyes to the full spectrum of low and high arts and extended this range to Byzantium and Europe's Middle Ages. Now, he maintained his early interest in architecture while embracing other interests, which include painting and sculpture of all periods, as well as archaeology. Much of his published research has concentrated on artistic production in Rome, particularly Baroque architecture, treating themes from liturgy to light metaphysics. Now, his most recent work has been on medieval and antique subjects, particularly on sculpture. Today, Fabio will be speaking on the topic either as they were or as they ought to be. Materializing Virtual Architecture in Antiquity, a very compelling title. I look forward to hearing more about this work, this idea. Please join me in welcoming Fabio Berri.
So, am I on? So a little sound check. Can you hear me? Yeah? And is it about this level okay? Okay, thank you, Alessandra, for the introduction, and thank you all for the invitation to come and speak as well. I've never been here. I've been to Indiana once before, to Bloomington, but that's the extent of my experience of the state. So it's nice, and it partially satisfies my curiosity. So what I want to talk about today is how we get to a point where we have this sort of architecture depicted in fresco on walls in villas, the domus, also temples, actually, public buildings. And I'm going to be talking about painting, really, and the origins of this kind of painting, but I don't really consider this painting. I consider it architecture as well. It just happens to be executed in paint, and it happens to be a virtual kind of architecture. And without it, this house, the Villa of the Mysteries at Pompeii, would simply be a series of boxes, really. And what I want to show what leads up to it, and how a wall decorated in this way depends for its meaning on substance, not just illusion. And although I will use the word decoration from time to time, I do it with a lot of hesitation, because it's unfortunately a word that makes ornament sound as though it's subtractable from architecture. And I think that's only a position that you really reach or begin to reach in the late 18th century. So this kind of painted architecture here, however opulent and however expensive the pigments were, and however complex and how much skill was necessary to make it, just wasn't quite good enough for some people. And by the mid-1st century AD, the homes of the Roman super-rich had become so encrusted in coloured marbles and mother of pearl and hard stones and gems and so on, that the encyclopedist and natural scientist Pliny the Elder lamented that fresco was now eclipsed, and coepimus et lapide depingere, we have even begun to paint in stone. Now, of course, this obituary of painting was somewhat premature, but he was also woefully anachronistic in accusing his peers of painting in stone, because this invention had actually been made by Minoan painters who had invented the medium of buon fresco 2 millennia earlier on the island of Crete. And now, in case you've forgotten what fresco is, this technique entails covering a masonry wall with a rough coat of plaster, the arriccio, onto which a layer, or more than one layer, of much finer lime plaster, the intonaco, is troweled and smoothed to cover as large an area as one can paint in a day. Now, here's a trial piece I did on a bathroom tile one summer. After preparing a one-to-one scale drawing of the whole composition, what's called a cartoon, the painter normally traces its outlines through paper into the fresh plaster with a stylus or pricks them with a needle and then sets to work painting. And the pigments must be diluted in lime water before they are daubed onto the plaster, into which they sink such that pigment and plaster dry to bond into an insoluble amalgam. And that's what you end up with. The fine residue of pigment particles remaining on the surface hardens into a protective crystalline mesh known as the lime crust, which can be buffed and polished after the plaster has been completely dried. And you can actually get quite a sheer and shiny surface with enough elbow grease. There is, in fact, a quite famous Gallo-Roman relief from the end of the 1st or the beginning of the 2nd century AD that shows painters and plasterers working side by side, executing every step in the process simultaneously. Now, because fresco is so associated with the Renaissance, few people, I suppose, imagine that the technique is as old as it is and was actually invented on Crete by artisans of the Minoan civilization at the beginning of the 2nd millennium BC. The most famous frescoes in the palace at Knossos on Crete include scenes like this Minoan rodeo with fearless toreadors somersaulting over charging bulls. Yet this painting dates somewhere between 1700 BC and the destruction of the palace around 1450 BC. Of course, these dates are very approximate, but they'll have to do. In other words, it was painted about 200 or 300 years after the invention of the medium itself. Now, the earliest datable fragments of fresco, which Sir Arthur Evans discovered in tiny fragments, were instead decorated with wavy patterns that scholars have either deemed abstract and thence decorative, or conceded represent mats or weaving or colored stones, and they therefore call them mimetic. Now, because Minoan figurative wall painting arrives so much later, its eventual emergence is normally taken to witness the graduation of mural painting from craft to art, from primitive to sophisticated, from an artisanal way of ornamenting a wall to the birth of an artistic consciousness. Where fresco recognizably simulates stone, it's an easy but quite unwarranted assumption that any simulation obviated the difficulty and expense of quarrying and fixing the real thing. This is a peculiar assumption for a number of reasons. First of all, the local gypsum that was used to clad floors, stairs, benches, and dados was pretty easy to cut and to soft to smooth. And this is a fairly rare example of a room on Crete where any of this is actually left still standing in place. It's the so-called Queen's Megaron in the Villa Palace at Phaistos. In fact, it's not even clear to me that the use of this kind of gypsum revetment actually predates fresco anyway. So the assumed sequence where you begin with stone and it's imitated in paint could be completely misleading, and with it the assumption that one thing imitates the other. Another reason to question this assumption is that since the late Neolithic period, the Minoans had devoted great skill and endless hours to carving out vessels, vases, and beakers from all manner of much harder stones. So from limestone, from marble, from breccias, from basalt, from calcite, diorite, obsidian, schist, serpentine, and so on. It's also the case that the stone that the Minoan painters represent actually doesn't really look like this kind of soapy gypsum that survives in the palaces. So if you look at the famous throne room here in Knossos. Just look at the difference between the painted dado there and the benches below. And before one of you sort of screams out, well, that's all reconstructed, it is, but there's huge fragments of this dado that survive. So it's a pretty accurate reconstruction. So you have to, again, you're quite subdued sort of stone below, and then this rainbow wavy thing above. And this painted stone has more affinities with these kind of luxury vessels the Minoans imported from Egypt, and coloured stones that they also brought from mainland Greece. So in this sense, the invention of fresco as a synthetic coloured stone belongs to a wider range of material synthesis of stones and gems within the Bronze Age that allowed artisans not only to emulate nature, but improve upon it. And this culture of synthesizing stone in other materials included the invention of glass, for example, which was basically like casting gems, or just glazing earthenware, where you take a terracotta pot, give it a shiny glaze, and it was as though it was made of a semi-precious stone, faience, or even the idea of firing clay into bricks at all, which is to make a kind of stone by giving it this hardness. But the most impressive example I can give you, really, is this marbled glass goblet, probably made in what is now northeastern Iraq and exported to Egypt in the middle of the 2nd millennium BC. Now, it's a convention to say that it's marbled. And it's a convention because the men who made this had never seen marbles, streaky or not. And therefore, they could only either be thinking of hard stones, which are veined like agates, or, in my opinion, what I think they're doing is creating a new mineral from their own imaginations. And in this case, they did it by fusing glass and powdered quartz and rolling it into sandwiches and slicing those into patterned slabs, and then marveling these slabs and flame polishing them until they acquired the consistency of a precious stone. And in this respect, even though there's quite a broad literature on material synthesis in the Bronze Age, believe it or not, it seems to have gone completely unnoticed that in a much earlier Sumerian epic, there's a section which already celebrates this kind of technological achievement and tells the story of a king, Enmerkar of Uruk, who under the inspiration of the artificer god Enki, fulfills the challenge of creating a regal scepter of no known substance by pouring a gluey compound into a hollow reed, which after 10 years he breaks apart once it's hardened to reveal something that is, quote, neither wood nor metal nor stone, which of course means it's a completely new material, unlike anything that exists on Earth. And you have to remember that scepters in Sumerian culture are regalia that are handed down to the king by a god, right? That's how kingship is conferred from heaven. And in some cases, some scepters were even worshipped as divinities themselves. So to make a scepter synthetically, as this thing is made synthetically, is really an act of creation with a capital C. Now, specialists currently hypothesize that, see what my next slide is, that Minoan builders first developed lime mortar to waterproof the joints between stones and external walls, which maybe they then painted, and therefore that must have been the origin of fresco, because people like very simple explanations. Now, this operation could have been a stage in the medium's evolution. It may have even have been the accidental origin of it. But there's also consilient evidence that fresco was consciously synthesized to make a material as hard and impermeable as stone, but with an even broader range of coloration and patterning than in the stones they had to hand. And this was achieved, this stone was made by dissembling and reconstituting the elements that the makers saw already in nature. So in reassessing the material origins of fresco, it's necessary to argue 3 points, really. The first is that fresco was devised precisely in order to synthesize colored stone. Second, that over time, the embodied image materialized within the wall and not on it, because as I told you, fresco is an amalgam. And thirdly, that this kind of painting would finally, the images within it would finally arise from the wall into relief, and that relief becomes articulated as architecture. So that's basically the kind of arc of the argument that remains. Now, in fact, Minoan ceramicists had already been cloning stone in clay for some centuries before fresco appeared, beginning with the vessels which are now known as vasiliki ware. So cups and beakers, again dating to around 2600 or 2200 BC, it's impossible to be precise, were brushed and speckled with amorphous patterns that immediately recall the veining of genuine stone vessels, sometimes found in the same cache, sometimes in the same tomb. And here's an example here. You can see the vessel on the left is painted, on the one on the right is actually a real stone. And another one up here, again on the right, you can see that's a form of alabaster, Egyptian alabaster, and how those patterns are imitated in ceramic. In the next generation of Minoan pottery, which is called Kamares ware, this stuff here on the right, and this is from about 1700 BC, and this is important. This pottery here, Kamares ware, is produced in the same period that fresco is invented. Minoan painters also came to correct the unruly veining of stones, which they ate with pleasing geometrical conventions, as you can see in this pot here on the right. So all these concerted simulations suggest that the development of fresco was neither accidental nor simply utilitarian. And I'd probably go further than that and say, actually, it's the experience of working clay, glazing it, and firing it in a kiln that might have even suggested to painters a kind of parallel cold process, which was fresco painting. Now, all of this is happening in Crete. Meanwhile, on Egypt, nobody is paying any attention whatsoever. They're completely unaffected by the Minoan discovery of fresco, and they simply continue to paint in tempera. So that's a pigment with a binding agent of glue, honey, milk, most commonly egg, straight onto walls covered with dried gypsum plaster, or what we would call plaster of Paris today. And what this meant was that the resulting painting is an emulsion. So it's a skin that's quite vulnerable, that can chip, and it will flake away over the years, as you can see in this relief. By contrast, in fresco, the coloration is as inherent and as petrified as that which the Minoans cherished in colored stones. And all the raw materials of painting were products of the earth around them. Paint didn't come in tubes, and plaster didn't come in sacks. The pigments were colored earths, sometimes even the blues, rocks and clays that were naturally tinted by the mineral oxides they contained, predominantly iron, but also manganese. Painters prospected the land for these earths, digging boulders out of the hillsides, crushing, washing, grinding, and drying them, and then rewashing them to increase the intensity of their color, or burning them so that yellows turned to reds. For these artists, used to the daily grind of mineral into pigment between stone mullers and stone slabs, the idea of painting in stone was more than just an idle metaphor. The same goes for plaster. The plaster needed to make fresco. So the lime needed for fresco plaster was itself a limestone or calcium carbonate that had been baked in an oven or on a huge bonfire until it composed into lime or calcium oxide. It was then pulverized and slaked with water in a violent exothermic reaction that transformed it into quicklime to make mortar and plaster. It was a really brutal and elemental transaction with nature. A battle of earth, fire, and water with the remnants consumed by the air. And the final fresco itself was another case of just add water, for no other binder was necessary for the pigments except the fabric of the plaster itself, because fresco was, as I have said, an amalgam. So to sum up, in fresco, the pigment, and so the image too, is in the wall, not on it. And so earthy are all its constituents that fresco represents the earliest example of painting in stone. And what this meant was that fresco was therefore a means of synthesizing nature rather than simply coloring or colorizing plaster, and materializing stone by reconstituting it from its basic elements. And fresco enjoyed an essential potential to, therefore, to create a secondary reality by substantiating something that would otherwise remain only depicted. And of course, it could be molded as well. It does not just remain a plane. These walls are never flat. So later ideas of illusionism, the idea that you look through a picture plane into the recession of the wall, are completely alien to Minoan wall painting. There is no picture plane, and there is therefore no illusionistic window onto a virtual reality apart from the viewer. There's a virtual substantiation, right? Not a virtual illusion. And a nice example that reconciles all these things that I've been saying, all these observations of the processes and significance of the media, and reveals how the materiality of the wall rewards its pictorial representation, is this room. So on the island of Thera, which is now known as Santorini, in the Cyclades, Minoan-trained painters painted a domestic room with the earliest pure landscape in Western art. Its subject is the natural world, a fecundating image of spring or summer with lilies flowering on mountain slopes and the courtship of swallows overhead. There's no perspective, of course, nor any sort of diminution of the components to intimate spatial depth. And by the same token, there's no background either. The scene isn't framed in any way. Instead, the earth presses up on the wall and swallows up the room at its most appropriate situation on the ground floor. Now, created in the space of years between a violent earthquake and the volcanic eruption that would eventually bury the town, the painters could not have been more aware of the chthonic force of nature in action. So they striped the mountains they painted with bands of greenish ochre, terracotta red, and bluey grey paint, which could stand for clay, pumice, or ash, even the lava produced by the floral eruptions depicted. Forgetting the final cataclysm of Thera, the island was, the middle of it completely exploded. If you go there today, it's a sort of C shape because the entire center of the island is missing. But forgetting that for a moment and looking at this more serenely, one can say that what you have here is a geological image of, it's not just a view of mountains, it's a geological image of the paint itself. The pigments that the earth offers up to the prospecting painter the basic conditions of nature. The most extraordinary example of such bounty is something like the rainbow dune, known as the Seven Earths in the Mauritius, which this dune results from the decomposition of volcanic rock into clay, and then the soil is tinted by iron and aluminium. And there are other heavily mineralized mountains in China and Peru and elsewhere. Now, the stratigraphy of Thera, and as I said, it exploded, is no less remarkable, even if the palette is nowhere near as kaleidoscopic. So in effect, the painter who painted these mountains is also retracing his steps to prospect the natural seams that rendered up the pigment. Now, the Minoan concern with presencing substance emerges from another fresco, this time at Knossos, where undulating lines separate and surround naturalistic partridges. And these lines have often been interpreted as representing rivers or just being decorative patterns. But the pottery I showed you earlier suggests that what we're actually looking at here is stone veining. And therefore, the painter is trying to emphasize how the image is actually consubstantial with the support. In another example below, a stone rises like an amoeba in water, only to become objectified as it slips over the surface into our realm as a slab. And what I'm talking about, well, it's this thing here. You can see it sort of floating almost like a bubble here. And then when it gets to the top, it's becoming more recognizably, well, if you've seen other examples in Minoan painting, more recognizably like a rock, like an object rather than an oil bubble in water. Again, these paintings are particularly fragmentary, right? So a lot has been added, a lot has been filled in here. But the particular junctions which make this transition clear, those survive. Now, this concern with presencing also meant that Minoan painting is very rarely flat. It's actually often undulating, and it came to be molded eventually into relief. And the implications of this, I think, and the trajectory, completion of this trajectory, you will see when a figure actually emerges entire from a wall, as in this famous charging bull, also from the palace at Knossos. Okay, from an early date, fresco spread to floors as well. And at first, the painters just coloured the mortar between the slabs. But because fresco was hard enough to tread underfoot, which meant your feet would never wipe the paint off them because it was actually within the plaster, eventually whole smooth floors were completely frescoed all over. And there are about 80 of these that actually survive from in various palaces and mansions on Bronze Age Crete alone. The capacity that fresco allowed, therefore, to synthesize the earth itself also meant that painters could create their own stones where nature was found wanting. And a really stunning example comes from all places, eastern or northeastern Syria. Well, it's eastern Syria, sorry. Now, I say of all places because it was long believed for most of the 20th century that the art of mural painting must have been brought west from Sumer or Assyria, and therefore the fresco technique with it. But in the last 20 to 25 years, archaeologists have instead realized that itinerant Minoan painters took their skills east, as becomes evident from sites in Syria, Turkey, Israel, and Egypt. And I'm just showing you one, which is the palace of Zimri Lim at Mari, and you can see where that is on the map there. And here, Minoan painters frescoed the upper face of a dais, you can see it over here on the left, in a large public hall, and perhaps for the king to sit on and pronounce judgment from, or otherwise as a pedestal for an effigy of a god or something. They frescoed this in reds, yellows, and bluey green ochres. And the one thing I should say, there's been this fresco here has been in literature on the subject of Near Eastern art in this period quite recently, including a very recent exhibition at the Met. And all the people who've written about it have spoken about it being a grisaille, which is a monochrome, black and white painting. And I won't mention who they are, but what none of them realized is that this is a black and white photo. It was taken in 1924. I looked up the excavation reports because I couldn't imagine what kind of stone this could be, So it was actually, again, highly colored. And it's therefore materializing, again, this sort of completely imaginary stone that was either inspired by agates, which are generally very small, hard stones, or perhaps Egyptian alabaster. And the material envisioned here is completely alien to the lithic environment of the palace. Because Mari, if you look at this Google Earth photo here, Mari stands on the silty banks of the Euphrates, and it is otherwise surrounded by desert. So having a synthetic stone like this on a dais, you might as well have had a meteorite in your throne hall, given the shock effect it would have had. Now, indeed, this taste for this kind of stone may have been inherited from the Old Kingdom Egyptians, who used a harder, glossier, more saturated alabaster, or we call it alabaster, it's really calcite travertine or something like this, but don't worry about that. I'm going to keep calling it alabaster, to make these precious vessels which they would export to Crete and later mainland Greece and around the Mediterranean, in fact. I was just looking at where was I looking at them? In Madrid, yeah, because they were exported to southern Spain as well. And in another room in this house on Thera, on the island of Thera that I showed you earlier, not only did the painters create dados of faux alabaster all around the room, but they painted just a vase exactly like this in the jamb of a window niche where the sun would have illumined it best and presumably conjured up the translucency for which these vessels must have been prized, because alabaster was a solar, heavenly material, and that's the fundamental reason it became a luxury item in Egypt. It seemed as though it soaked up the rays of the sun, and the greatest quarries of this stuff were in Upper Egypt to a place called Hatnub, whose name actually means, in Egyptian, mansion of gold. And so it's not terribly clear in this image, but if you look at the top there, that's the room, and you can sort of make out the dado down here, which is faux alabaster, and then that very deep window there. It's actually in the window reveals that you find these paintings of these vases. So they would have been in raking light and always, unlike the rest of the room, always very brightly lit. At a Canaanite palace in Tel Kabri, which is in the Galilee in Israel, Minoan painters would fashion the whole floor of the throne room as a checkerboard of facsimile gypsum or onyx, and more examples keep coming to light. I mean, excavations every 2 or 3 years, it seems at the moment, keep finding these floors. However, the taste for these sort of pavements, even outdoors, reached its acme in Mycenaean Greece, in the palaces of Homeric fame. So places like Mycenae and Pylos, but also Tiryns and Glar. And these are all palaces that date from around 1300 BC. And when these floors were first uncovered in the late 19th century and at the beginning of the 20th, the pattern grids were thought to represent textiles. And they were said to be carpets, as though there were a whole series of sort of mats had been laid down on the floor. But it's now long understood that the variegated lines and dots are actually mostly conventions for stone veining and mottling, and therefore rather like actually the vasiliki ware I showed you at the beginning. Even so, the floors may combine evocations of stone and textile side by side. I'll show you that slide again instead. And together with, I mean, they're often marine octopuses, for example, marine animals often figured, and altogether they compose an assemblage that completely supersedes any possible reality. And all frescoes, of course, were also highly polished, as I said earlier, like the best quality stones, like gypsum, alabaster, and marble. And this accentuated not only their affinity with the stones through luminosity, but it also decanted at the same time some of their earthbound nature. And that's very important when you consider you're going to be standing on it. So if you look at Piet de Jong's imaginative reconstruction here of the throne room at Pylos, it's the type of hall in which Telemachus in the Odyssey blurts out, "Can you believe your eyes? The murmuring hall, how luminous it is. This is the way the court of Zeus must be upon Olympus. What a wonder." And if one seeks parallels more familiar to the modern world, we could talk about this environment. We could see it through the lens of magical realism in 20th century Latin American literature. Or one of my favorites, we can imagine the spectator in a hall like this is akin to an avatar in the virtual worlds of the contemporary internet. It's in the Megaron, it's only the pavement really that gave any solid footing in mundane reality, and the shimmering surface of this made even that footing seem precarious. Now, traces of the origins of Minoan fresco as a synthesis of colored stone appear in the ball leapers I showed you earlier, in this border of overlapping and striated scales, which quite probably represents a sort of stone that is now called conglomerate, and which was very popular for making some of those ornamental vases. This sort of detail, of course, never receives much comment in art historical literature because it literally lies at the margin, and there's a far more engaging narrative scene at the center. But if you look at it closer, you can see that it's not really simply a circumdelineation. So it doesn't turn the corner and just frame this, that it's continuing off-screen left and right, and that's because it belongs to a border that would have circuited an entire wall. And in fact, what it is a sort of painted truss. And I'm just going to show you what the border would look like, as you can see in this, again, a very famous room at Knossos, the Hall of the Double Axes. And you can see on the back wall there the double lines, in this case with a spiral motif. Now, to make a border like this in fresco, which remember is imitation stone, or it really is synthetic stone, was again to materialize something. And this time what it materializes is what lies beneath the fresco, because the walls of all these palaces were half timbered. They were cages of wood in which rubble was packed in clay, and the rigidity, overall rigidity of the wall was established by this hidden structural frame. Now, it's been regularly a retrospective projection of modernist expectations and tendencies to think of this X-ray transparency in terms of structural honesty, a concept which was invented in the 1830s by Pugin. But it's perhaps more accurate to think of this representation as a sort of petrification of the wood within the wall. Indeed, when this occluded framework emerges from the wall, as it does here, left and right, it's in the shape of very hefty beams and posts. Not only this, but the distinctive triple banding of these frescoes, so the way the wall is divided into three parts like this, came to reflect the introduction of orthostates. And orthostates are basically upright slabs of stone that lined the walls inside and out. And they were normally about this height, as high as you could saw a piece of stone that you could place against a wall to protect it, because functionally, orthostates were what we call kick zones, but they also prevented the walls from wicking water. So any kind of infiltration at the base, whether it was your foot or a dewdrop. Symbolically, however, the orthostates communicated with the generative earth. They were sort of miniatures of the mountain ranges that filled that room in Thera. They're basically stones, phenomenologically speaking, they're stones that are rising into the light. Now, the role of fresco in materializing revestments and masonry doesn't halt here, of course. One finds the same sort of decorations in those Homeric palaces of Mycenaean Greece. And here are just a few fragments for you to look at for all of 2 seconds. And the technique has a very long afterlife. So across the Eastern Mediterranean in the classical period, and then spanning from Egypt to Rome in the Hellenistic period, a means of decorating walls with marbleized stucco developed, which was only supplanted by real revetment, real marble revetment, in the 1st century AD, as you'll remember, Pliny moaned at the outset. The earliest example, in fact, we know of a wall really being covered with marble slabs was in the 4th century palace of King Mausoleus at Halicarnassus, and that's never been excavated. So there's not a trace that remains. Even then, we know from literary sources that the marble only went so far up the wall, and the rest of it was hard stucco that was so polished it looked like glass, apparently. You can imagine what this would have looked like from, that it would look very similar, I think, to this wall from Pella, the ancient capital of Macedon, from a building that has been, after its excavation, imaginatively called the House of the Plasterworks. And this dates from the 3rd century BC. But there are also a lot more examples on the island of Delos. And the reason they've survived is because on Delos, they actually had lots of loose fieldstone from which they built the buildings rather than mud brick or fire brick, which is what was normally used. So there are a good many of them. And these decorations have been called, and people have settled on this title now, they go under the name of the Masonry Style. The illusion is painted, of course, but I can't really say it's pictorial, because the architecture here is arising as relief. And only that remnant, if you look at the slide on the left, only that remnant which is colored blue suggests that there could be a sky beyond it. Otherwise, you're confronted with the wallness of the wall. Now, in time, the color schemes and molded relief of these walls spread to the Italian peninsula, where they were reincarnated in the Roman idiom, very well known today as the first style. This is a nice example, the house of the Samnites at Herculaneum, and here it is decorating the entrance to an atrium of a house. And on the left here, in the middle here, is just a closer view of this. So you can see that there's a lovely breccia, particular kind of stone that's being imitated. And that's in there for no good reason, actually. That's it's Lawrence Alma-Tadema, who's paintings are, what's the word? A guilty treat, I always think. And so evocative of the materials of antiquity, because he would go there and you can see him with his sketchbook copying down every pattern. So this is a representative example. Now, how did this practice got to Italy is probably, we don't really know, probably through the Greek colonies of southern Italy, of Magna Graecia, and then it was probably adopted by the Etruscans in central northern Italy in a somewhat flattened form, as you can see it here. And the reason to believe that this is the way things went is primarily this tomb, or the tomb of the Satyrs, or the Francois tomb at Vulci, where the tomb chamber with these ledges for miniature sarcophagi is arranged in the form of a dining room of a triclinium, therefore suggesting that maybe dining rooms, or quite likely dining rooms, of Etruscan palatial homes were decorated in the same way. 2 centuries after this, now still in Etruria, but a Romanized Etruria, you will find a continuation of this tradition in these dazzling remains, all fragments from the loggia of a house at Populonia from about 125 BC. Now, the technique really hadn't changed very much since Knossos. In this case, they used a particularly brilliant white stucco, and it had, I think, quartz crushed up in it to make it shine all the more. And on top of this, the painters conjured up the illusion of at least 20 different alabasters and colored marbles that could hardly have been available on the open market, although it's possible they took bags of small samples around with them. And they may have had them, but the people who lived in this house quite likely had never seen these marbles. 100-odd years after the arrival of these kind of wall decorations in Italy, Vitruvius will explain them by saying, quote, "The ancients who first used polished finishings originally imitated the varieties and arrangements of marble veneers." And everybody basically takes him at his word on this. But in truth, there isn't a scrap of evidence for the prototypes that Vitruvius postulated to justify what is actually an a posteriori rationalization. And what I mean by that is that before the advent of spoliar construction in the Middle Ages, there simply aren't any walls made of heterogeneous blocks of differently colored marbles. There's not a single example that I can think of, and surely in now centuries of archaeological excavation, some relic, however paltry, would have been found. So it seems no coincidence to me that the only text I know of to mention of a wall of this sort is Plato's Critias, which describes a netherland, Atlantis. Nor, by the way, is there any evidence, interestingly enough, for coloured marble revetment, for none has been found either. I can think of 2 slabs of grey limestone orthostate at Pergamon, and that's it. And it's very unlikely there would have been anyway, because the vast majority of houses, even palaces, had footings and sometimes a low wall in stone, but the rest was mud brick or fired brick if you were lucky. And these walls simply weren't strong enough to bear the load of several tons, which is what slab after slab of marble amounts to. They would have just caved in. Even then, even if this were true, when you examine these faux marble walls, you will find that, and don't worry, I'm not going to show you examples, that blocks run round corners, or you'll find that the margins of the block are a different color to the boss in the center of the block, none of which, of course, is possible in real construction if these are really supposed to be real blocks of stone that are being imitated. Nor is it true that this is just some kind of pretty wallpaper, that it was an economic substitute that could be used because the real thing was just too expensive. Because if we look back at this house of the plasterworks at Pella, that vermilion paint that's used there is cinnabar. And cinnabar was absolutely one of the most expensive raw goods in the Mediterranean, and it earned the castigation of conservative Romans who just couldn't believe it, that you'd spend all that money on a paint that expensive. So to sum all this part up, in this, all this make-believe construction was not an image of what was, but what could be. And even these painted reliefs, even though they can pass themselves off as almost plausible construction, they have no true reference in reality. They are simulacra. They are copies without an original. And this reminds me of Aristotle's most problematic definition of mimesis, which is in the title of this talk, that, quote, any maker of likenesses must necessarily, in all instances, represent things in one or other of three aspects, either as they were or are, or as they are said or thought to be, or have been, or as they ought to be. The representation of the wall is an idealization. You might even call it a heroization of material possibilities, lifting the prose of construction into a creative dimension where it becomes a thing of poetry. Now, it's within this context that the absent marble appears in all its painterly potential, because they thought of coloured marbles from the outset as a form of frozen painting. And the reason they did that was because the number of colours that you could find in stones in nature, or even in the same slab, and because the veining itself was brushy. And even if they hadn't thought that, the actual act of making plaster and putting paint in it would, of course, could only reinforce this idea that stone could be a form of painting. Another reason they talked about it in this way as natural painting is because you could occasionally find images within the stone naturally occurring the same way you do if you look up and see a figure in clouds. And ancient painters copied this idea too by birthing their own chance images within the plaster. So again, the House of the Plasterworks here, and if you zoom in, this is looking at this part of the wall from the side on. And if you zoom in on that area there, you'll find that in the painted breccia here, there's this peculiar animal. And it took me a bit of time to realize what it is. It's actually a dolphin grabbing an octopus in its jaws. And of course, the interesting thing here is, well, you might say, well, maybe this guy was just so bored out of his mind, you know, painting little bits of stone all the time, that he did this as some sort of joke. And of course, that would be the kind of explanation I would expect from an archaeologist, actually. But what I think is happening here is this is a painter who's seen fossiliferous stone, he's seen fossils in stone, and given that he's actually creating the stone himself on the wall, he's created his own kind of fossil, however impossible that might appear to be in nature. And I wouldn't have to show you any more, but because they're quite fun and you won't see them anywhere else, I'm going to show you a couple more. So this one's known. This is on the side of an altar in the House of the Gilded Cupids in Pompeii. And here you can see as the veins tangle and knot, a human profile comes out. If you're in the Metropolitan Museum in New York at any point in the future, nip into one of the rooms and you'll see this. It's from a villa at Bosco Reale. Yeah, see it in greater detail here, where you get a vine leaf, okay, which is a materializing out of apparently a granite background. And of course, granite is one of the few stones in which you would never see a pattern arising. It's, you know, like the steps outside here coming to this building of granite, it always has that kind of grain. Again, the only time this has been mentioned is in the catalogue of these remains, and fortunately, I can't remember the person who wrote it, but they said it must have been a mistake. It's hysterical, isn't it? But what you have here, of course, is a kind of pointillism, you know, before the letter. It's stippled. Now, a more sophisticated, and I should have really had it this way, a more sophisticated version of this sort of thing you'll find on Delos, where the walls are very complicated. You can see you have orthostates, you have meanders, you have various kinds of bossed courses as well. And the painters would stick in the middle in several of these houses these figured friezes, sometimes with scenes from drama. And if you look at one of these here, it's a scene of Ariadne and Hypnos. You can see how the painter has built this up with layers of cream paint over a dark red background. So this isn't fresco. The paint hasn't sunk into the plaster. The strokes, you can rub your hands, fingertips over the paint, and you'll feel the strokes. It's painted a secco, dry paint, like laminations on top of each other. And I think what the source of this is Cameo. Is probably the inspiration for it. So the fiction you're getting here is, again, one that is consonant with the kind of lithic fiction of the entire wall around it. Now, we're in the home straight here. You're happy to be no, this is my conclusion. By Vitruvius's day, that's the 20s BC, Mycenaean palaces had long fallen into ruin, and the Minoan ones sunk into total oblivion under their own debris. By now, the idea that mural painting was mimetic was taken for granted, and consequently, also the idea that first-style representations must have had real-world prototypes. That is, that they must have imitated marble walls. An eon had passed since the Aegean invention of fresco, and therefore the origin of fresco medium as a substantial reification rather than an optical simulation had been completely forgotten. By Vitruvius' day, the first style was being supplanted by the second style, wherein the wall hosted perspectival illusions of a theatral architecture that framed yet more fantasy architecture in receding vistas. And the wall surface is now sheer, it's reliefless. All the illusions are sealed beneath its surface. Perspective has dissembled the first style wall into a layered space in which everything becomes an object. The difference between Minoan creations and these kind of later frescoes is the difference between a civilization that melds nature and its representation into one animistic continuum, and another that is now influenced by the science of things and the science of optics. Nonetheless, while the second style tends to be regarded as an evolutionary step towards illusionism, and therefore the emancipation of the viewer and their roving eyes, it actually remains rather hermetic. You never really seem to look that far beyond a wall or into a landscape, for example. And the proliferation of columns in the frescoes actually bears witness to the growing use of marble ones, real marble ones in the home. So to portray them is to actually materialize the house even more. And that illusion of depth is almost a byproduct of the increasing structural complexity of the representation, which is still guaranteed by the stoniness of the medium. And in the very years, let me see if this is the last slide. Yes. In the very years in which Vitruvius wrote, the second style was itself giving way to the third style. And in fact, the culmination of this very estrangement from substance, which I've been charting, and growing devotion to objecthood is a fresco like this one in the Villa Farnesina, Rome, from the mid-1st century BC. Now you have relatively shallow recession of the virtual wall, and this all works to make a kind of stage for a variety of represented paintings. So you have classical Greek panels in tempera or encaustic, with or without folding shutters to protect them, fresco representing fresco painting, and even small-scale sculpture. But the illusion of space has led to a deficit in substance, and the wall has now become a pinacoteca. It's an art gallery and it's an art world. Thank you.
you so much for such a fascinating presentation. I'm sure that there are questions in the audience.
You are? Yes.
Yes, I really like the idea of the creation of these stones, and it makes perfect sense. The ones it's hard for me to connect them with later art. But what I'm wondering is, and this is a completely honest question, in the palaces and houses on Crete, are there colored stone orthostates or lower parts of the walls that have been discovered in the excavations?
There's a fair amount of orthostates, external orthostates that survive.
But colored stones?
No, they're gypsum. There's a certain kind of gypsum called Ballatino gypsum, which has sort of swirling kind of reddish veining in them.
Okay, because I'm wondering, the reason I'm asking this is that anyway, I don't know whether you've been around the Mani Peninsula looking at ancient quarries.
Yes, I have.
Okay,
yeah.
So you've seen the brecciated limestone
Yeah.
quarries,
Yeah.
particularly the very south on the east side, that are reds and greens
Yeah.
and grays.
Yeah.
So since you do have these based, at least conceptually, in stone,
Yeah.
I'm wondering whether you make the connection between mining as a source.
Yes, absolutely, definitely, because from the Mani comes serpentine.
Mm-hmm.
And I don't know if you remember this, but if you walk around the lower kind of terraces at the back of the Palace of Knossos, back as you'll find a storeroom which has got a pile of them there. But they weren't using this for architecture; they were using it for jugs and things like that. So there are gypsum revetments that survive. Phaistos is the most complete ones I've seen, and there are fragments elsewhere. But it's this soapy stone. Soapstone is what we would call it in England, actually. And it's nowhere near as exciting. Probably once it was originally cut and polished, it would have been a little more vibrant. But it doesn't look like the stuff they paint. Yeah.
It's what we used to call Proconesian limestone.
Right.
Which it isn't anymore. It's not from there. It's from mining. I don't know how they brightened it up when it was in situ, whether they put some kind of sealer on it, but when it's wet, it's extremely bright.
Yeah. I mean, I don't think they did it. I mean, it was just polish, really. Yeah. And once you get to the Middle Ages, they start using pig fat, believe it or not. So Mark in Venice has pig fat on it, which won't say dark. But it's just you honed the stone and then you polished it. And with gypsum, it's so soft, it's very easy. But also, by virtue of the fact it's that soft, you can't get a really high polish on it. So we're saying the same thing. So I was saying, yeah, they use it, but none of the painted stuff looks like it. And the painted stuff is instead of it, in fact. And the most veined gypsum is this Ballatino stuff. And it's not a patch on the kind of true marbles that you can get, places like the Mani. Yes?
In the image with the blue background and the full carving, is that part of that like running band?
Yeah.
What might have been the other panel? Would they have continued with imagery, or would they have gone presenting stone?
And then having tea after the... I don't know, because they haven't survived, unfortunately. I mean, that thing looks very big there, but if you go and see it in the museum, it's actually quite small, and it's remarkable that survived. But I don't think there are, I haven't been through the... yeah, it's very funny how this stuff is actually published. I was about to say I haven't been through the excavation reports, but the excavation reports are by Arthur Evans, and then those are being republished as people go through his notes. So it's not always entirely clear exactly where something was found. I mean, that room is known, but the fragments that were found with it, there's not a systematic archaeological report, and I think they just picked the things that were, they were the most fragments for a panel and put them together. And in recent years, it's become very clear just how arbitrary those reconstructions are, as well. I mean, there was a great little show in New York recently, which showed drawing by drawing how people went from, something that size and got a whole panel out of it, like Frankenstein's finger or something. But so we don't know, or I don't know. Anyone else?
Just sort of a
Yes.
sideshow off the plaster. So you maintain that remnants or stone put against a wall required basically Roman concrete, something quite stiff.
It required a
As a
wall.
core,
Yes,
right?
it required a wall with a lot of mass.
And it waited until
No, they did. They do use it, but you can basically only use it, you know, up to like the height of this doorway or something, right? And I mean, that's probably the longest slab you could get. Okay, and then also if you start using it higher than that, you're actually making the wall unstable, aren't you? Because you're. You know,
unless it's a very thick wall.
well, yes,
You
but
have it on both sides.
but it would have to be really thick, and the walls at Pella are like that, you know, of these houses. So I mean, yeah, statically, it's just asking for trouble.
It's just interesting. Never heard of it.
Yes,
Are those events mechanically fastened to the walls? Are they with bronze?
the Minoan
Or
ones,
Are they essentially glued?
they're essentially glued to the walls. The Minoan ones, yeah. I haven't seen any cramps on them or anything. Not that I'm aware. I mean, I hope I'm not making a mistake. Not that I'm aware, but then they're really not high enough for it to be necessary. They're just held on by, yeah, suction.
So would that then why they didn't?
Well, I think by the time you get to the 4th century BC, they're using cramps in architecture already in masonry walls. So it wouldn't have taken them very long to figure out that they could put something in the masonry, you know, and it would hold the thing in place with a dowel or something, which is what the Romans did. So I don't think it's because the technology didn't exist. I think it became necessary at a certain point. And, you know, maybe the Palace of Mausolus did have those, but it hasn't been excavated. I mean, its site hasn't even been discovered. So. Yeah. Sorry.
There's some beautiful
Yes.
later tomb vaults in Egypt. The Egyptians never went fresco.
Well, they
even later.
They do, but it's not them. It's the Greeks who bring it to the Nile Delta. Yeah. That's the first dated, it was the first instance of fresco. I'm trying to remember the name of the palace, but I can't remember it offhand. Yes, it's again, the Greeks take it. The Egyptians, I mean, they've done lots of other things. You know, they've invented architecture in stone, for example. They just weren't interested in this kind of painting. Yeah, it is, I suppose.
I have one.
Yeah.
Sorry, because it's really long. You mentioned there was a recurring concept throughout your presentation. It was more, especially in the last part, transition from illusionism, imitating the mimesis of stone things, and instead the concept of the wall that overlooks a third dimension, windows. So you said pinacoteca, the quadro, but an associated idea is that the painting per se representing a window. Now, and that's something that resonates with the second style. Now, have you, in some of the frescoes that you showed us from Crete, there were some seemingly architectural frames represented in the foreground, associated with some kind of a landscape. So, where, if you have looked into this, you trace the origins of the figuration that imitates the third dimension, which shows landscapes created by an architectural setting. Like that's something that
well, I mean, the problem with answering that question is so much of Greek painting has been lost, right? So what one expects is, I mean, there is, yeah, I think there's a tomb in Alexandria I can think of where you have 3 doorways and there are trees in the doorways. So it implies that they're framing a view beyond. But that also may be derived from stage painting, about which we know nothing, for example, although Vitruvius tells us that perspective is used already in stage painting in the 5th century, doesn't he? Yes. So it depends whether you believe Vitruvius completely about that. But if that's true, there's an alternative tradition for that. And I guess you could even at that point look at vase painting or something and talk about figures in edicures and a sense of depth, you know. I'm not saying it didn't exist. What I'm saying is that a particular way of treating the wall as architecture, all right, and articulating the wall as architecture has this genealogy that goes back to materializing an image in the substance of the wall, rather than treating the wall as though it's a piece of glass that you look through, and therefore it's illusionistic, and therefore it's to do with optics. Well, just forget optics for the moment, but it's inevitably to do with optics, but it's illusionistic, you know, because that's really a kind of retro projection of Alberti and the Renaissance view of the illusionist wall. And I think there's a stronger argument, which is the one I'm making, that you have to think of this as being a substancing, right? Which then, at a certain point, there's a paradigm shift, which probably happens in Alexandria, which we first start, although people keep saying it happens in Italy, but I cannot believe that because, you know, the center of studies of optics in the ancient world would have been Alexandria. So there's a paradigm shift at a certain point, or where the wall becomes about viewing through. Now, it's normally said to be the second style, but for me, the second style really isn't. This really doesn't feel to me as though it's about penetrating the wall and going beyond it. It seems to me it's more a kind of aggregation of architecture being brought to the wall. You know, and there are things, I put this one up on the right there because it's a good image, and it's the other end of the same room, basically. It gives you an idea of how, yes, sure, it's illusionistic, it's painted, there is some depth there, but it's closed up at the same time. You know, it's hermetic, it's still about the wall. So there's kind of multiplications of means by which you represent architecture, and architecture is present in the room, right? And the primary point to be made is this is not an addendum to architecture. You know, it is architecture by other means than construction.
This is a little off.
Yeah.
And that is, so you don't see the tradition of structural orthostates that came in the late Dark Age and Prinias and places like that that are decorated, that are not decorated in the same way, but carry figures as belonging to this tradition, the Minoan tradition at all. That's a separate tradition that was brought in from the Near East and really didn't have anything to do with the continuation of Minoan tradition.
Well, there aren't any Minoan examples, are there?
Well, no, not a figure, but I'm just saying you have orthostates and you have stone sort of.
There have been 2 or 3 fragments of string courses in stone that have been found on Crete, and it's been suggested that they were stuck over beams on the outside.
What I'm talking about, I love the idea of the painted.
You're talking of the temple
being inspired,
but
inspired in a very creative way by stone patterns and that sort of. I'm just saying you don't see any connection.
Prinias, the temple,
with that stone, that stone inspired force, decorative force at the bottoms of walls.
Well, were they orthostates? Because I mean, which reconstruction?
I'm just saying that they are. Oh, you're talking about Prinias?
Yeah.
Well, I mean that's a good question. I do believe that they're.
Yeah, but I'm fine with. I mean, it could be. I hadn't considered it. It could be. Would it change the argument much?
No. I would just not at all. I'm just wondering whether it's just. I mean, it seems in some ways, similar in conception. They're not. One is not actually structural, and the other one would be actually structural. But they are inspired by stone. One is actually stone. They're at the base of the wall. They do have a kind of architectural feeling, just in terms of a base, a middle, and upper part. I'm just curious that was maybe one of the reasons that Crete was receptive to.
But author states are introduced in Crete much earlier than that. I mean, they're introduced actually, again, around the turn of the second millennium, I think. Aren't they? Even before that. So they're really early.
The earliest figure relief completed earlier than yes. With Hania,
Oh, yeah.
between the late 8th and 7th century. And in that case, too, we don't know whether it was so-called
Yeah.
not or else.
Or
Very
some people even dispute that it was a frieze, don't they?
freeze independently.
Yeah. But anyway, that's 8th or 7th. I mean, that's it's like modern compared to that. It's 1,200 years.
So, yeah.
A little bit less depression. Are there any literary references? You said that there's the Alexandrian evidence, but did Pausanias describe this Stoa, the painted Stoa? Is there any? There's no literary.
The Stoa Poikile in Athens.
There's no reference that describe the landscape painting.
I don't think in any great detail, no. Yeah.
It's gratuitous, it isn't.
Yeah, I mean, most of the the understanding of this development in Roman painting is Vitruvius and archaeology, and the archaeology has simply really shown how widespread it was in Italy, and that there were lots of different local variations on it, and actually that there's just as much interesting painting outside Pompeii and Herculaneum.
I was wondering if Pausanias had covered it.
No, he's quite late anyway.
Well, I mean, the early.
Oh.
Going back. Thank you very much.
Well, is there any final question or comment? In case we thank Fabio Berri very much for his fascinating presentation.
So credo.